everyone. Thanks a lot for joining. We are meeting at the end of a Saturday. We'll keep it brief. We'll make sure that you get something out of this webinar. Now, just a small instruction. I'll request everyone except the speaker to please put the mic on mute so that we don't have any disturbance. Yeah. Great. So firstly, let me thank you. Thank you, National Law School, University Jodhpur, for collaborating with. Let me introduce you to the speaker. Vivek Rathod is partner at Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas. He has been a part of CAMP and this practice for over 10 years now in the project and project finance, right? Uh, all participants, please keep the mic on mute. Right. Now, I may not even go into the details as to the plethora of transactions, the plethora of experience Mr. Rathod has in the both project and project finance sector, right? What makes all the more relevant for him to join this webinar is since the time he has graduated from Nalsar, right, has been a part of the project and project finance team of Cyril Amarchand. So he has seen a top tier firm, the practice of project finance grow and evolve in the past decade, right? That brings me to the purpose of this webinar. Why are we joining here today with the whole motive of understanding what project finance is, right? Now, until few years back, if I talk about most of the law firms, if I talk about most of the corporates, we did not had a separate practice area called project finance. It was generally a part of a larger sector, which is banking and finance. However, in the last few years, we have seen tremendous growth in this sector. We have seen a large inflow of money. There has been foreign investment, there have been domestic investments. Uh, give you a number, right? Since 2000 to 2019, right, there has been an FDI inflow of about $14.54 billion, right? In 2020 budget, the government has put forward about 100 lakh crore only for infrastructure, right? So that has basically led to increase in the number and size of transactions which we are looking at, right? Now, which is where we come in as lawyers. Now, when the sector is growing, number of transactions are growing, size of transactions are growing, the demand for project and project lawyers are the law firms are corporates for sorry, Vivek, any issue?
Yeah, your voice is cracking, Utkarsh, sorry.
Is it better now?
Yeah. Better now.
Right. So, as I was saying, that a lot of law firms, there are a lot of corporates are increasing this size of the team at a extremely paced level. For example, I was a part of Khaitan Projects team in 2017. From then to today, the team size has grown almost doubled. Right. The similar trend we have seen with other firms like DSK, Lutra, AZB, Cyril Amarchand, which has been the leader in project finance sector. I think Vivek is here to brief us about how his format has evolved. Now, since the transaction size of these transactions are so big, right? The demand for freshers and associate level employers or lawyers come in, right? So the firms are hiring. The firms are finding it increasingly difficult, to find fresh lawyers, to find young lawyers who have specialized skills in this sector, project and project finance. Now, uh, unfortunately, the law colleges, a lot of these law colleges, till today do not have a specialized subject or curriculum for project finance. A lot of colleges have come up, but again, we are at a very nascent stage. So the demand and supply between a skilled young lawyer for this sector is is completely unbalanced. So any person or any graduate, any fresher with the right skill set has the pick of the job, right? So which is where we come to this webinar, right? If where we'll be first taking up, we'll try understanding the project sector, project finance sector. We try to evaluate if we have interest in this sector, what this sector is about, what are the kind of transactions, what are the stakeholders, etc. Right? And then if we see that if we have interest, we'll take a second two of the Now, if I'm interested, what my career in this sector would be like? Is there actually so much demand? What are the skills I require? What are the do's and don'ts for me as a law student, as a young lawyer, etc. Right? So this is the motive of this webinar. Now, this also brings me to the purpose and the motive of the platform SkillX, right? Now, SkillX is nothing but a bunch of industry leaders coming together to skill young lawyers and students like you, right? So the platform can be divided into four parts. The first part is actually the skilling part, right? Where the industry leaders will come and skill you in more focused area, which is actually required for the actual profession itself, right? Second part would be the assessment, where you'll actually be assessed on something more practical. For example, on drafting, on case studies, something which the employers are actually looking for. Third part is the mentorship, where again will be as process, what questions, what CV, etc. Sorry, Vivek, there's still some.
Yeah, yeah. If you can just probably use the mic this way, I think a lot of people are saying that they can't hear you clearly.
Oh, are we better now?
Yeah, slightly better.
Yeah. Uh, so sorry. I think there has been some technical glitch at my end. Uh, so that is the platform, right? And once you are skilled, once you are completely prepared, you will be then directly referred for the job. You will be directly referred to the HR teams of different law firms, different corporates, and possibly for internships or recruitment, depending on which year you are in, right? So that is the platform about. Now, we'll jump straight back to the webinar. As I said, the webinar is divided into three sessions. One will be the subject as to what project finance is. The second is the Q&A on the career part, right? What does the career look like in this sector? And the last would be the live Q&A, right? I request everyone, right, who has any questions during any of these sessions, please put up your questions in the chat section, and we'll be very happy to take it forward at the end of the two sessions, right? Again, my request would be please keep the mic on mute. If we are unable to take any question at the end, we'll take it later through email or through phone, right? With that, Vivek, I would request you to take the session one forward. And yeah, over to you, Vivek. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Utkarsh, and thank you, SkillX Pro team, for organizing this talk, and thank you to everybody who's joined on the Saturday evening. So, as discussed with the team organizing this, the purpose for the talk today, at least from my perspective, is to give students an overall view of what projects and project finance practice in a law firm looks like. If you choose to do that, what would you be doing and what kind of advisory work would you be involved in? And generally, give some thoughts on my learning as to what could you do right now as a lawyer, as a student in a law school, to prepare yourself to take up this profession as well as take up this practice area if you so choose to. So I have devised this talk in a manner where I'm assuming that, a lot of you may not have encountered as to what projects in project finance is. A lot of you may have undertaken courses in your colleges or have interned with firms, so you may be familiar. So there may be an overlap there. So bear with me on that. If you have any questions, if there's anything that you already know, then we can take it up later, right? So as we were discussing, India being a developing country, we have a long way to go to develop the requisite infrastructure in the country. Now, when we say infrastructure, it talks about the real core sector, which is at the bedrock of developing of an economy or for a country. Sectors like core sectors like roads, airports, and power, oil and gas, telecom, mining, real estate. These form the basis of any economy. You guys would have followed, the discussions around the slowdown because of COVID and the plans that the government is making the push is towards developing the infrastructure, because if there is a push there, if there's an investment in this sector, it has a cascading effect on the entire economy as a whole. So there is a push from the government, and there is a lot of focus to continue developing this sector in India. Now, if that is the case, I'll take a step back and talk about private players in the infrastructure sector. Traditionally, infrastructure development has been the obligation and role of the government. Now, with the opening up of the excuse me, the opening up of the industry and the economy in the early 90s, private parties were allowed investment into these sectors. Now, it is incumbent that the size of these projects are so huge. The project cost which is involved to develop these are in thousands of crores, and this is one of the key differences that you have for the infrastructure sector and any other project that any company or a group will undertake. We're talking of 10,000 crores, 40,000 crores projects which are as big as that. Now, there is no private entity in India which is able to invest that much of its own money, right? So it is necessary that if private parties have to be brought in for the development of infrastructure through many mechanisms that you would have heard of, like PPP and all, it is necessary that some part of this development cost is also funded by debt. Now, this debt is something which is funded by the banks, of course, banks and other financial institutions, which goes into the development of the project. And this is where this was the start of project financing in India. So in the early 90s, when it was very nascent, there were very few banks who used to engage in this, like an ICICI or an IDBI. And slowly and steadily, there was a lot of interest with the development of the infrastructure sector, and multiple banks coming in, people understanding what is project finance. Then there are additional banks, and almost most of the major banks today participate in project financing, and that forms a bedrock of their exposure to these groups, because these are long-term investments by the bank, and that is the nature of the project, that these are long-term. That is one of the key differences that you would see with respect to any other kinds of financing which is there. So as I was discussing the kinds of sectors which uh, get picked up, so there are two different aspects of this practice. One is projects and infrastructure, which is advising the project developer. So say for example, like a Reliance or an Adani or a Tata, if they are developing a power plant, or a GVK or a GMR is developing an airport in Delhi or Bombay, for that matter, you would have heard about Adani is now getting into the airport business. So if you advise these developers to set up these projects, and the second phase is with respect to advising the lenders or the borrower for procuring the financing for such projects. That part of the practice is called project finance. We will discuss separately as to how project develop, what is the life cycle of project development, as well as what is the life cycle of a project finance transaction. I'll briefly go through that so that you're able to understand the kind of advisory work that we do within these two small brackets within the larger practice. Now, you know, first is the project development. So there is an investor or a developer who wishes to develop a project. I'll give an example. Say a Tata wants to set up a steel plant in Kalinganagar, Orissa. So what do they do? Who are the key stakeholders at the development stage? First and foremost is the developer who wants to develop that project. The second is the government, and the third is the end user. Keeping aside the lenders for a second, at this development stage, these three parties are clearly identifiable as a key stakeholder, without which there is no incentive or a possibility for developing any project. If there is no investor, if there is no developer, nobody will set it up. The government controls most of the functions. They grant approvals. In cases, they also grant land for the projects. So their involvement is necessary. The third is, if you are developing an industry, it is for revenue generation. So whatever it is, electricity, roads in terms of the end users, customers who will use the roads, if there's a steel plant, end users for the steel which is prepared, which is manufactured at the plant, you need end users and customers to buy that. So these are the three key stakeholders at the initial stage. Another important stakeholder in this is are the lenders, who I will tie up slightly later, right? So how does a project start? Right from the time that the developer says, okay, I want to develop this. So there are two ways in which a project can initiate. Either it is at the instance of the government, where the government has figured out a necessity for a particular infrastructure development. Either it develops it itself, but increasingly, as we've seen, it's moved to pushing out these developmental activities to the private sectors. So they will invite the private players for investment, and they will put out bids where the nature of where the nature of the arrangement is PPP, where the government is also going to be involved in some manner. They will put out bids, request for proposals, inviting investment from these developers. Now, while I give a life cycle, I will assume for this talk that it's a PPP kind of a transaction, right? So initially, what happens is there is an identification of requirement for the project. Then the government, in this case, will devise and discuss with their advisors as to what is the best mode of participation of the private entity. If it is within PPP, there are different modes. You would have heard BOT, build, operate, transfer, design, build, operate, transfer, TOT in cases of road projects, which is toll, operate, and transfer, as to decide what is the nature and extent of involvement of the private players which is required. Once that is devised, then they develop the documentation, which is the bid documents, setting out what are the terms of involvement. It will set out which kind of parties are eligible to bid. For this eligibility, they will set out technical eligibility, they will set out financial eligibility, because they want to ensure that somebody is developing it, because it's a very critical asset for the government and the country, that only people who are able to, who have the experience and will be able to carry through it successfully, are qualified enough to bid. Because it is a government bidding, necessarily the bidding parameters on the financial side usually involve that whoever quotes the lowest or whoever quotes the highest, depends on that, will be granted the contract, subject to, of course, them meeting the technical criteria. But that is a general rule with an exception, where the government in the bidding documents will also keep flexibility to grant it to somebody else who's not a highest or a lowest bidder, but who may be better suited for some other reason. So once these bidding documents are set out, these developers are given certain time to analyze and undertake a risk assessment of the documents. So typically in this case, even the contracts are set out, the concession agreements are part of the bid documents, where these developers will analyze the risks associated with the project. They will review the contracts. There is not too much leeway granted to the private players to negotiate the concession agreements if it is in a PPP model, but they do have an ability to seek queries and get things cleared or corrected if there are any errors, or if there is any aspect which has not been dealt in, which is in the larger interest of the project. Then they can send their queries and they can be taken on board. But there is a limited room for negotiation. So this is the process which is there. At this stage, if you are a projects lawyer, a developer who wants to bid for such contracts or such development, will probably come to a law firm and seek your advice, giving you these bid documents, asking you to analyze these documents for them, and ask you about the risk. This is akin to a diligence, but not necessarily in the manner that you would know from your internships in law firms, where it is considered a very dreary experience. But this is more from a very critical risk assessment perspective. So they will give you that for your review. You will advise them where all the risks are in the contract. Those risks, they will determine whether they are typical risks for such projects, whether these are risks which can be mitigated in some manner, either legally or for that matter commercially, certain risks can be built up in costs. So if the contract says in case of breach you will have to pay a liquidated damages, right? So if I was to bid say 100 rupees to get that contract, and there is no, and if it is, if the risk is not usual, but if I don't have the ability to get that amended or negotiated, what I will probably do as a bidder is that price that risk and put it in my bid. So instead of 110 what I was to bid, 100 what I was to bid earlier, now I will bid 110. So no, so that risk is apportioned in some manner. And taking a step back, you would also advise the authority or the government to prepare this tendering package, this RFP, RFQ, the concession agreements, the state support agreements which form part of PPP projects. You will also advise them to come up with these things. So these are the two avenues in within the project space where you will advise, at least in the lifespan that we've discussed until now. So the next stage in this is based on the advice, internal assessment, financial diligence, legal diligence that's being done by the developer. They will make a bid to the government authority. Now this authority will analyze the bid. This may be in two forms. One could be technical and financial. Whoever passes the technical moves to the financial round, and once the financial bids are open, the best bid there typically is granted the rights to this project, to develop this project, develop the project, as well as the rights to appropriate the economic fruits out of that. So let's say, for example, if the government has bid out the right to construct a 100-kilometer highway, it will be coupled with the right to collect toll on that as well. Because if the developer is putting in the money to develop that road, it needs a return on its investment. And that is where they get the right to toll for the 10-year period or 15-year period, whatever it is. So that is the incentive of the developer. And the government's incentive is that they have created a national infrastructure asset without having spent anything. So they've put it out to somebody else. They've ensured that the usage is just in a manner that it's akin to a cess and a tax. If you guys know, the difference is that only the people using it will have to pay for it, as opposed to if the government has would have developed a road in say Karnataka, right? It is unlikely that a citizen in Delhi or Bihar would use that on a regular basis, but the development costs are going out of the exchequer. So this is one of the fundamental principles as to why we moved to the PPP stage. Coming back, once the bidder has been selected, they will be awarded a letter of award, after which certain conditions are required to be fulfilled. Then you will sign the concession agreement. The concession agreement, after signing, it has certain condition precedents to be fulfilled before it before the developer has the actual rights to the concession. Now these conditions can be in the nature of procurement of land for the project, depending on the kind of the project it is, procurement of various licenses and approvals. So this is another aspect where you as a projects lawyer, along with your real estate colleagues, will advise on acquisition of land and procurement of the licenses and approvals which are required. The next stage in this would be, if you are, I'll give an example of a road concession, just to keep it consistent. If you're a developer, it is not necessary for you to construct the road by yourself, or even to operate the road by yourself. So what I say, for example, if an IRB as a road developer may grant an agreement to a Larsen and Toubro to construct the land. Now that contracting, if you're advising on the project side and to the developer, that contracting is typically called an EPC contracting, which is engineering, procurement, and construction contracting. So that is a contract where you'll appoint a civil construction guy to make the road for you. Then there are other contracts that you may choose to enter into to get somebody who's experienced in just operating the road. Once the road is constructed, you may just get a guy who will do the tolling booth. The other one will just do the regular operations and maintenance to see that once the road is set, it is in the required condition and quality. So you can be the project developer, but you can also subcontract parts of these. If you're advising the developer, you will be advising them on drafting, negotiating, and advising on such contracts as well. So that is one. The next, typically after signing is the phase for tying up the debt. Now this debt I will deal in a separate topic where we talk about what is the life cycle and what is the process to be followed for a project to initiate and complete a project finance. But one of the CPs for such contracts is also to procure the requisite debt for the project. Once that is done, the disbursement under the loans happen, the payments. So from this loan, the developer will pay its contractors to develop. So it will use these loan as well as some of its own money, which is called equity, to fund the project cost, development cost for the project which is being undertaken. Once, so this phase is called the construction phase of a project, where typically the entire risk or most of the risk lies with the developer as well as the lenders as well. Because in project finance, as opposed to any corporate finance, the key difference is that it is a non-recourse loan, and the project finance is given to the entity which has the rights to the project, and the lenders are only looking at repayment from the proceeds of the project. Once the project is revenue generating, only from that are they looking to get the revenue. For security as collateral for giving that loan. See, if you take a home loan, your house is mortgaged to the bank till the time you've paid it. So similarly, if you're granting a loan, you would want some tangible security that in case the borrower breaches its repayment obligation, you have some asset that you can sell off and recover the maximum extent of your outstanding to the borrower. So in this case, in project finance, the security which is granted to such banks is the assets of the developer itself, for that very specific project and no other project. So if a Tata Group is taking a loan to develop a steel plant in Kalinganagar, it is within a project finance bound. They are not going to give security over the shares of Tata Motors or the assets of Tata Motors, or even for that matter, the assets of any other steel plant that Tata may have. So the risks and rights, both of the developer and the lenders in case of a project finance, is limited to the assets that it is funding, the specific project in case. So that is the reason why I was saying, when the lenders have funded the developer to create that asset, and until the time that asset is not created, right? So there is no real security in the hands of the lenders. They have paid the money. Now they are completely looking at the developer to comply with its obligations and ensure that the project comes up within time. Because if it is delayed, then so once the construction phase is complete, the revenue or the operation phase starts for the project. In case of a steel plant, once it is set up and once you've started manufacturing and once you start selling your product is only when you start getting the revenues. So this is the only time that the lenders can get repaid. If the lenders get repaid, and whatever is left after that is what is left with the developer as his incentive, that is his return on investment. So it is in the interest of the developer as well as the lenders that the project is completed as soon as possible, that from the high risk phase of the construction phase of a project, it moves to an operations phase where there are tangible assets in the SPV which is there, which is a special purpose vehicle, which is incorporated to develop and work only that one specific project. And so that is commencement, then there is construction, and then there is operation. And in case of a PPP transaction, the rights to such a private developer are limited for a specific term. Now this term may be consistent with the kind of investment that is required for such projects. Typically all infrastructure projects are long term in terms of development, in terms of recovery of investment as well as the tenure of loan. So these are the key differences that you will see from the project sphere. So just a quick recap that these are the different aspects, broad aspects of uh, infrastructure development. If you're advising the developer, you will advise them for bidding, creating of the bidding documents, for entering into project contracts, and advising them on licenses and approvals. Now, what kind of contracts can be pertinent for a developer at this point in time? First we discussed the concession agreement, then we discussed documents that you may require with respect to land acquisition. So typically, if you're a projects lawyer, you will not advise on land acquisition, because that is a very specific and focused practice area. So the real estate team of your firm will be advising on that, but they will work in conjunction with you. The third is the development contracts that I discussed, is EPC contracts, supply contracts. Say for example, in case of a steel plant, you may need a boiler, you may need for power plants, you may need boilers, you may need turbines, you may need furnaces. All these are very, very high value contracts. In most cases, they are also imported, so you will have to enter into a very sophisticated procurement contract which sets out the rights, obligations, etc., etc., from the developer until it reaches the from the supplier until it reaches the developer. It will have processes and obligations around how it will be assembled, how it will be transported, when the risks will move, what are the warranties which are given with respect to the proper functioning of such equipment, and the rights and liabilities, of course, associated with both the parties. Now, in cases of conventional power, there are contracts for raw materials. So if you are running a thermal power plant, you need fuel. So you will need contracts for a coal supply. You will need contracts for water supply. There are byproducts that you need to dispose, like fly ash. Once you burn the coal, there will be asbestos, etc., which needs to be disposed of. So there are multiple such contracts that you will need. We may think, if we haven't seen this, that what's so special about such contracts. It just says it just involves buying and selling, uh, but it's much more than that. These contracts form the bedrock from a project finance perspective as well. While this is essential for the project developer to know that I need this tie up with my vendors, suppliers, etc., etc., so that my project comes up, it is also the interest of the lenders to see that the developer has tied up all the various contracts, including the contract for supply. So if you are a electricity producer, one is having all the contracts which ensure that you are able to generate it. But all of this is useless until and unless there is somebody to procure the electricity that you're generating. So that is one of the key contracts in this case. Those are called power purchase agreements. In cases of steel plants, you will have supply contracts to the offtake contracts for the producers who will buy your end product of steel. In case of an airport project, there are no contracts because it's the end users, people like you and me who go to the airport. If you see, there's a particular portion component of your ticket, which is the passenger service fee, which goes to the airport. So the airport has been developed, that is their compensation. Similarly, in case of road projects, wherever you're paying toll is the final revenue for such developers, right? And then we also discussed operations and maintenance contracts, and then finally are the revenue contracts that we discussed. Revenue contracts are the one which where you sell your end product. So this was a key brief of advising the developer, which is the project side. We can go into detail, but given the time, we don't have enough time, so I've tried to keep it short. You guys can ask me any questions if there are any. So I'll quickly move to discussing the project finance side. While I touched briefly on what it is, now project finance, why is it different? Is it just lending to a company, or is it more than that? Now, lending to a company, all of us are aware. We've seen it from banks as house loans, vehicle loans, personal loans, etc., etc. How different is this? The key difference in a project finance as opposed to a corporate finance is that this is not a balance sheet financing. Now, what is balance sheet financing? If I give a loan, to say Tata Sons, and it is not for any specific project or end use. They just say I need working capital for that matter, or I need to acquire some other asset. In which case, I just need to look at, does this company have adequate revenue? How does it books? How does this company's books look like? What is their track record? What is their credit rating? Can they pay me? Will they give me some security? And I will give that loan, as opposed to project finance, where I said it is a loan granted to a special purpose vehicle which is incorporated by a developer like a Tata Sons or a Tata Steel will have a Tata Kalinga Nagar Private Limited, which is incorporated only to develop a particular project. Now, there are no other assets in this specific company other than that particular company. The loan which is granted to this company can only be used for a very specified purpose, which is developing the project and nothing else. And of course, that is contractually determined, but in the very basic understanding of project finance, it is a very specific end use loan for development of a particular project. Lenders are looking at repayment only if the project succeeds, right? If the project doesn't succeed, in very few cases that you will see that there is a guarantee given by the sponsor, or that you sponsor being the parent of the SPV, that if they don't repay or if the project fails, then the lenders have access to assets of any other company in the group. It is very rarely the case. Companies where the credit rating is not as good will provide additional support more, but if it is not the case, these are AAA rated companies. In the very traditional notion of project finance, your recourse is limited to the SPV itself and nowhere else. So, and this is the reason why I said, lenders typically, they are not concerned with how the business functions. They are not concerned with any changes or risks associated with the business or operations of the company. That is the key difference between an investor in a company as opposed to a lender. That investor, say for, I'll give a an example, that if you own say 1,000 shares of Reliance, right? Tomorrow it can go to 5,000 rupees and it may come down to 800 as well. You do not have any recourse there, right? You will only get what the value of that share is, as opposed to debt, which means that regardless of whether the project works or not, the company goes bust or whatever happens, your outstanding is still there. Whether they're able to pay you or not is a different thing, but the value of what you can recover from such borrower is always absolute. The difference in case of a project finance is that while this is true, they slightly take up risks associated with investors as well. As I was saying, if the project doesn't complete on time, if the project doesn't complete at all, if any licenses and approvals are terminated because of which the project cannot operate, it has a direct impact on, one, if it is during the construction stage, for the ability of the project to come up on time. Second is, if it is during the operation stage, if any issues come up, then the ability to get the requisite revenues. Now, if this is the case, right, if the lender is dependent on the project working, it, in case of a project finance, they take a role of a quasi investor of sorts. Then while they are purely, while the nature of the rights is purely debt, but the risks are quasi investor like. So unlike regular financing, corporate financing, the lenders would want to have a very tight control and insight on how the company is working. They may be able to, dictate at times as to how they should what do you call, if there are any issues for any management level decisions which may have an impact on the project, the nature of business, assets, disposal of these assets, or big management policies or change in business plan, they may want a right to have a say in that. And to this extent, the lenders don't become only lenders as opposed to a corporate finance. So this is one of the key difference that you would see between project financing and corporate finance. So coming to discussing, if the company wants to get a project finance loan, or if you are a lender who wants to give a project finance loan, or if you're an advisor, a legal advisor, a lawyer who's advising on such a transaction, what is the process of such project finance transaction? So Utkarsh, if you can just help put up that slide, please, page 10.
Yes.
So typically what happens is, during the development stage, the developer is going to analyze what is the project cost. So in case of a steel plant, they will work with advisors to formulate that the cost for setting up of this power plant or a steel plant is going to be 30,000 crores. Now, this 30,000 crores, as I said, cannot be funded completely by the borrower because no one has that much money. It cannot be completely funded by debt, that they can't come and ask the lenders that you give us the entire 30,000 crores. No lender is going to fund that because uh, lenders are not in the business of running any projects, or they're in the business of lending, right? Slight difference being that they're more involved in the project finance, of course, but the business is run by the developer. So they need some skin in the game from the developer for them to also participate in this entire project. So to that extent, there is a leverage ratio which is determined based on the risk appetite and what the market standards are. Now leverage ratio is for a project cost of say 1,000 crores. The leverage ratio, if it is 70/30, that would mean that 70% of the project cost will be funded by way of debt by these lenders, as opposed to the 30% which will be funded by equity, which means the developers own money. So 70/30 together, that will fund the project costs. Your documentation and terms of the loan will determine how the investors are going to bring in their money. At times they would want them to bring the entire money upfront so as to be sure that the developer is involved in this matter and they will do their best to develop the project. If the leverage ratio is high and there is only minimal participation from the investor, the lenders run a risk that if something's not working out fine, the investor or the developer may not do their best to work it out. That okay, I have just invested 100 crores and it's fine. At least I'm not losing 1,000 crores. It's 900 is of the lenders, and I'm fine. They can come and enforce security, take whatever assets of the company which are there, and I'm cutting my risk. So to ensure that this doesn't happen, the idea is to increase the involvement of the developer in terms of their in financial involvement in the project. So after this determination of project costs, lenders typically appoint a consultant called an arranger. Now, because this loan size of such projects is very huge, right? It is difficult for any one lender to fund. So in this case, there are multiple lenders who form a consortium, and the job of the arranger is to ensure to get together these uh, various lenders, pitch the project to them, tell them about the bankability, that it is worth putting in your money, the risk is low, that the developer is good, the track record is good, they have taken the approvals, they have acquired the land, and the project development is at XYZ stage, and it's not risky, but it's also a good investment for the lenders. They bring them together, they help formulate a term sheet, the key terms on which the lenders will grant the loan. After this is done, I've skipped the financial and technical feasibility, which forms part of the pitch, which is made to the lenders. That these arrangers will undertake the feasibility of the project. They will prepare a information memorandum which will house all of this information. Debt syndication basically means that you've putting together all. If 700 crores was the debt component of the project, you need to ensure that you've gotten commitments from at least whatever number of lenders put together, it should come to 700. And once that 700 is in place, the debt is called as being tied up. So after this, the sanction letters and the term sheets are done. Sanction means that the board or the appropriate authority of the banks have taken a decision that subject to certain checks and conditions being met, they will fund this particular project and the company. For this, they undertake a financial and legal due diligence. This is a stage, typically the stage where lenders, lawyers will come in. So here, this is at one time lenders may also or the borrowers may also take your advice during uh, discussing and formulating the term sheets, which are the key terms. So they may take your advice as to what it should be, whether this is what do you call market standard, if the lenders have set out certain terms, what are the implications. If you're advising the developer, if you're advising the lender, then you will tell them that what conditions and what rights and what obligations should you put on the borrower to ensure that the project runs and on time and properly. You may advise them on what security they should take so that the recovery is uh, more or less sure sort, and you will advise them on enforceability of these of the documents that you will enter into as well. So after this due diligence and everything is done, you draft and negotiate the financing documents. Now these are typically the loan agreement that you would have seen, the trustee agreements, the trust and retention agreements, which is the accounts agreement. Now this agreement sets out that how all the revenues of the borrower will be treated. These revenues are charged to the lender. Charge means that there is security created on these revenues for the lenders. And as I was saying, the lenders keep a very close track of the assets and working of the company till the time they've received the money back. So they keep a tab on how the cash flows of the borrowers move. Now, after the documentation is done, there are certain conditions for the borrowers to meet, and once that is done, they will disburse the money. Once the disbursement is also done, during till the time they are not repaid, as I was saying, they will keep a track on whether the loan is being worked properly, the borrower is doing everything on time, and this is where you will be advising for a project finance loan. So project finance, there are multiple structures. There are domestic loans, there are ECB loans. ECBs are external commercial borrowings. In certain sectors and for purposes, you are allowed to take foreign currency loans where the lenders are abroad. So you will be talking, you can advise on transactions like this. There is interplay with FEMA laws, because the promoter may be a foreign entity for granting certain security and all, and what kind of money can come into the borrower. You will be also advising on things like that if you're working on a project finance transaction. So this was, typically the life of a project finance transaction where a lawyer will be involved. So you will be talking on this, advising on these terms. Then, yeah, your role as a lawyer for these transactions will depend on whether you're advising the borrower or the lenders. The perspectives change drastically. Where we get involved is drafting these contracts, negotiating these contracts, having them executed, helping them create security. So the typical project finance documents that you will see on a day-to-day basis in your internships, if you go and if you intern with a project finance team, or when you practice that, will be the facility agreements. Then there is a trustee agreement. Trustee agreement is appointment of a trustee who will hold security on behalf of the lenders. Then I discussed the trust and retention accounts agreement. Then there is a agreement which is entered into between the various lenders of the single borrower. This is called an intercreditor agreement, which broadly said determines how the lenders will take a decision in relation to that loan. If any security has to be enforced, they come to a consensus based on the processes set out in this. If any waiver has to be granted or any decision for that matter has to be taken with respect to the borrower, This agreement sets out the parameters and processes and the voting pattern and the percentages which are required before any decision can be taken. Uh, if you guys are familiar with project finance, you would have heard about security documents as well. Now, these security documents are the most probably the most essential fallback for any lender to grant a project finance loan. Now, what is a typical security created over? It will be created over immovable property, movable property on the contracts which are there for the projects. They will be assigned. The shares of the borrower held by its shareholders will be pledged in favor of the lender. So there will be a share pledge agreement. There will be a deed of hypothecation for charge over movable property. If there is just an assignment of any contracts or any assets, then there can be an assignment agreement. There may be a sponsor support agreement. Now, the sponsor support agreement is a very specific non-guarantee related obligations undertaken by the parent, which may sometimes say that, if the project cost, I was giving an example of 1,000 crores, where the cost was tied up between 30 equity and 70 from the lenders for any reasons, including inflation or delay in completion. If the project cost increases to say 1100, who is going to fund the additional 100, right? The lenders may not want to increase their exposure at this point in time, but it is also very critical for the lenders to know that the project gets completed. Without expending that additional 100, that project will not complete, and therefore the rights of the lenders with respect to the asset which may value 1,000 is almost zero without the project being completed. So what lenders will do is require the shareholder or any other sponsor to put in the deficit. If the cost has increased by 100, they will require the sponsor to put in that additional as their contribution. This is called cost overrun, cost overrun obligations of the sponsor. Typically, this and other technical support, if anything is required, will be put in by way of the sponsor support agreement. Then, in very limited cases where a project finance will have a corporate guarantee, that is a document that you will see. Other documents are substitution agreements or support agreements in cases of PPP and concessions. And then there will be direct agreements entered into between the project counterparties and the project developer, which basically means that, if the lenders have enforced their rights of assignment on a particular contract, they have an ability to replace the borrower and get some other replacement entity to step in into that contract, so that the third party can also enforce the rights under that contract. This is usually after a default is there under the financing documents. So this was a broad overview of what the practice will look like. This is not exhaustive in any case, uh, right? But it's just a broad overview. Now, coming to what you can do if somebody is interested to pursue projects and project finance. The scope is vast. As Utkarsh was discussing earlier, most of the law firms now. So I must start by saying that, if you want to undertake projects in project finance, typically that can be done working with a law firm. Now the scope there is huge because the kind of transactions which are there, the nature of the industry is long term in nature, so it is not impacted as much with micro level fluctuations in the economy or risks associated, because it is long term. You will see that the sector is gradual, it increases, it doesn't dip like a capital markets transaction, capital markets practice. If the markets are low, it doesn't go down comparatively. So, and because we are a developing country and the government's focus is there, this practice is going to grow, and there is always going to be a requirement for lawyers in this field. Now, that just that by itself should be a reason for somebody to take this up. It is very important, like anything else, that this topic or this area should interest you. Now, the best way to do that is read about it, talk to people who've done it or who do it, and intern. So when you're interning, that is one of the most important times when you can explore as to what your what your inclinations or what your interest lies in, and maybe the courses and things like that which are there out there in the market, that helps you to be prepared to know things which will be thrown at you. If you join a firm, people will not expect you to know anything about this, because everybody is joined without, most of the learning happens in law school. So when I graduated from college, the first day when I landed up in the firm and with my team, I was asked to do something, and I had absolutely no clue what it was. So most of your learning will be on the job. So if you are a step ahead in terms of, if you are able to figure out what you want to do, which practice you want to join, right, and you can prepare yourself for that, read up about it, intern as many times as you can, it gives you a head start and an advantage in terms of, it sets you apart with other your colleagues there. So to that, reading and internships I would put out as key things for anybody interested in this to do. With respect to what you can do to prepare in college, and what all laws are important if you want to practice projects in project finance, I would just go back to the fundamentals, right? Everything else can be learned, and as cliched as it is, as in we have to use law school as the time that helps us how to read law as opposed to reading all the laws, because it's not possible to do that, right? So focus on your fundamentals, contracts act, the key of the constitution, administrative law, sale of goods, things like that will come to your use day in and day out. Contracts law, you can't do anything without it, or everything is based on that. If you are a project finance lawyer, you will also have to have familiarity with commercial laws. FEMA, you will have to read up how RBI works. You'll have to read up on various master circulars that RBI set out, which regulate the banks for, regulate the banks in their business. If you are in the project financing sphere, you will end up advising the banks. Banks have to play by what the RBI sets out. So to that extent, it is important for you to see what the banks can do, what are the terms, conditions on which they can lend. Now there are different sets of parameters and guidelines and directions set out by RBI of how the financing should be if it is to each different sector. So that is important for us to know. Master circulars on, say, loans and advances, income recognition and asset classification, uh, external commercial borrowing, etc. These are things that typically, at least in our times, we weren't taught in law school, but this is something that is your bread and butter as and when you join any such practice. So if you can read up on this before, familiarize yourself as to how FEMA works, what is the structure, how RBI works, what are the key guidelines, master circulars, etc., which regulate this practice, it will keep you on a different parameter than other people who may be your peers in this case. Other thing, the entire practice now, it's been a while since this practice is there. Now it's not, now it's in a very mature state for that matter, from a developing economy perspective. But I think the next step that you will see for project finance in the next 5 7 years, it is going to be lawyers who have sector specialization, right? So currently you will see most project finance lawyers will say, okay, I advise oil and gas clients, I advise steel clients, I advise mining clients, telecom, power, renewable energy, everything. But slowly within your practice, as you grow more and more, you will automatically develop a slight niche, that by virtue of just advising more clients of a similar nature, or by virtue of your inclination and interest, you may develop an expertise in renewable energy, or in the airport space, or the road space, or or steel or metals and minerals, right? So you will start as a generalist. Towards the middle course of your career, you will start getting a specialization. But increasingly, as the case is with advanced markets like firms in London for that matter, or in the US, where the project financing had taken an advent much earlier, you now see that they have practice groups within the larger project finance practice, as this is an oil and gas group or a telecom group, right? So we are moving there now. So this is important for you guys now, because by the time you guys come out, if you're in the third year or fourth year, then it's not so imminent. But in the next 3 or 4 years, even recruitments may happen that way. So we don't know yet, but the market is definitely moving there. So for you, it's while it's a discovery phase, you don't even know whether you want to do project finance. So to figure out within project finance which sector do I specialize is probably a premature decision. But if you have any inclinations towards projects and project finance, my suggestion would be read about these sectors where such financing and such different sectors within the infra space, so which will give you, it is important for you to understand how these works, because when you're discussing with a client, you're advising a clients love and they keep a lawyer separately in a different pedestal if you tend to understand the business. You're not necessarily expected to write at the first instance, but if you do, then you are a different lawyer. If you can talk their language, you can understand it. And without understanding the business of how even the technicals get put together, it is difficult for you to advise on the project side. At least if you are advising on the project side, if you're doing a diligence for an infra company, for from a lender's perspective, you need to understand, okay, for how does the project set up, what happens after what, to understand whether the contractual rights and the contracts are in place to ensure that the project is coming up properly or not, for you to identify the risks. So in this, it is very important for you to understand the business, read up about the sector, know how the business works. It is, you know, one easy way to pick this up is you can go to SEBI's website, right? You can go to SEBI's website, pull out DRHPs of any company which are listed who are in the infra space. They have a business section of which sets out what businesses they undertake, how do they undertake it. It may be a 30-40 page read, but if you just pick that up for a good company, a market leader in that space, it can give you a nice brief idea of how things work in that sector. And when you talk about that sector, or you're working on a transaction in that sector, your understanding of the documents, even if it is only from a financing perspective, will be very, very different. So that is something I would highly advise for people who are interested to do that. Next, and this is a very cliched suggestion, but work on your speaking. If you Even if you're not going into litigation, at the end of the day, while your notion is that law firm job is a desk job, as in one way it is, but it is always a people's job. You're always talking to people, you're negotiating with people, you are explaining laws to your clients. Your clients can be lawyers, your clients can be business guys. How you speak and explain to a in-house guy who's your client will be different to a business person within the same client group. So your ability to comprehend laws, comprehend issues, and translate that as advice or a conversation, depending on who the recipient of that conversation is, very material. The better they can understand you, the more they will like you. So this is one thing. If if somebody is advised in college, can you work on, then it is something definitely should be done. Like, it is akin to speaking skills. If you want to be a litigator, it is goes without saying, but it also applies in this case. Research is another point which will you will do right from day one until till the time you're practicing. There is no end date for doing research. These skills are critical, and there is no end to the kind of laws that you will not research within projects phase. So that is another big sell of the projects area, projects and project finance, that it keeps you in touch with the real laws and statutes that you've learned or you've learned how to read. and it doesn't coop you in a cube that if you're an M&A lawyer, then or if you're a capital markets lawyer, your sphere of laws that you deal on a day-to-day basis are limited. Not to say that you will not venture out, but things that you touch upon on a day-to-day basis is limited, as opposed to if you're in the project space, because of the diversity of the kinds of businesses that you will advise, it is very very varied. So that is at least one of the things that interest me, that you will be in touch with different kinds of laws. It doesn't get boring. So these are the things that I would generally advise. Internships, as I said, are the key. So it makes or breaks a career. It's a is meant for both the law firm and the person who is interning to figure out whether this is meant for them or not. So it is more than just a certificate. It is your avenue to learn. That is one. Second thing is to figure out whether it interests you or not. So if you are at any internship where you are not getting adequate work or the kind of work that you want, just walk up to the person that you're working with and ask for that. Believe me, people like such interns and they will give you good work. So it's on you to take out as much from the internship as opposed to it just being more than a certificate. So this was a general what do you call roundup on what is project finance practice and what is projects practice, and how you can probably prepare if you are interested in this. Happy to take any questions that anybody may have on this.
Great. Thanks a lot, Vivek. I think that gave us a very good highlight as to what project finance sector is, and you actually did my work easier by also taking up through the different career prospects in this sector. Right now, I'll quickly take up a few questions. Right, we have been getting a lot of questions in the chat section, which a lot of them you have already answered. Right, but to start with, Vivek, you said that it's important to be interested in this sector. Right.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So, Vivek, let me start by this. How did you decide to specialize in project and project finance?
Okay.
What interested you in this sector?
So my story is very very different, and I am not a good example of how I landed up in doing projects. It was just by luck and chance. My internship in I did my internship with the then Amarchand projects team in 2008, and one of the advice which I gave to go and ask for work was coming from how I landed up with the projects team and how I end up doing projects today. Is I was assigned another team which at that time didn't have work, and the projects partner just happened to sit across where I was sitting, and I was idle, and I walked up to his room and asked him for work, and then I got a call back for my another internship, and I got a job offer, and since then I have just worked with the projects team. Good for me at least that I ended up liking it, but I, unlike the students today, didn't have options of number one information. I didn't have as many seniors when I started for me to tell me, how what the practice is. I didn't have, so many platforms where you can talk about or have information like yours as well as to what is projects and project finance. It was a path of discovery for us, right? So as my advent into this was a matter of chance, for that matter, students today can take an advantage of the situation that information is available everywhere. So a lot of these firms, at least my firm I'm aware, has this rotation policy where students are given the new joinees are given opportunities to move around different teams to for 6 months teams, just like the training contracts that you have for foreign firms, where you can work with different teams before you finally choose which practice area you want to join. So that is a very critical difference that I'd say. Make use of that to figure out what you want to do. If you have decided, then just stick with it, but you should make use of that. And each practice area that you go, if you have certain basic information or understanding, right, your ability to take away from that internship will be much more than somebody else. you know And I can tell you for a fact, good interns are remembered. I remember an intern, or my team members remember interns who did good work. We even pulled out some of the work that they've done 3 years after they've left. So I remember, if we're looking for a research, and then I remember, okay, XYZ had come, and there was an email. Then you go and pull out, and you have that thing there. So it's important, hard work there, and initiative in internships is very, very important, I would say. It will just set you apart. So if somebody doesn't have great grades, right, this is the time for you to put out. The grades will probably get you through the door, but finally your work is what will stand. So I'm not saying grades are not important, please do work on that, but it is not the be all and end all. Internship is, after you get into the internship, your work can be a great leveler. So it is an opportunity which you can use it that way if you want.
Okay. Okay. Now, Vivek, along with interest, one another question which generally is in anyone's mind when he's choosing any practice area is generally if there is that kind of demand for lawyers. I mean, you don't, I
Hello,
mean, if
hello,
obviously if you're very interested in, you can, but you don't want to join a sector which
hello.
is already very crowded, right? Now, coming back to project sector, project and project finance, and if I talk about, say, law firms, right? We have generally heard, and this is the feedback which I received from most of the law firms, that project and project finance team is generally full of work, long working hours, etc. Right? So, do I
Hello,
assume that
hello.
in this sector we have good demand for freshers and lawyers in general?
Yes, there is. There is. So you would typically see firms which do project finance will have larger teams than other transactions. So by virtue of the nature of transactions, you will have a typically larger team involved in one transaction. So, and because the sector is growing, there is demand right now, and there will be demand. So not to deny that, of course, it is a demanding space, but it is also very enriching and rewarding. So to answer your question, I don't see that teams are going to stop growing, and to that extent, I think there will be space for recruitment, and there will be space for more and more lawyers, of course.
Okay. So, okay. Now, Vivek, if I ask you about the specific
Hello,
situation now, with respect to just a small
hello,
request for the participants, if there's any
Utkarsh,
question,
sorry,
you
I
can
couldn't
put
hear
it in
you.
the
There was
chat
some
section, please.
noise in the background. I couldn't hear you. Sorry.
Yeah.
hello,
Any
hello,
question, you
hello.
can put it in the chat section. Yeah. Sorry. So, Vivek,
Please
coming
open the
back to
chat
the
section.
question, uh, what is the impact of COVID on this sector,
Please open the
specifically
chat
not
section.
from the transaction side, but from the career side, in terms of recruitment, in terms of new hirings, in terms of work? What is the impact of COVID in this sector, especially for a person who is looking forward to join or get a recruitment for this sector?
So this is, something firm to firm. So I won't be able to
My
advise
chat
you.
section is disabled. Please enable it.
Okay, somebody is requesting for the chat section to be initiated. So, anyways, so coming back on the impact on of COVID in for recruitment, I think everybody is just figuring out how the markets are going to play. So have their own policies depending on where they practice, and how what is their projection of the market. I think this is too early to say that, to give any comment on this, but I don't think this is anything which is long term, and in a couple of quarters I think we'll be probably able to know better on this. So, to my understanding, most firms have honored the offers which have already been made. So, how it goes on to the next case will depend on where the market is. That is also to an extent market related, and not to say that this is not consistent with what do you call the requirement for this practice. So this requirement for this practice over a longer time is always going to stay. Whether firms will recruit immediately during this COVID or not depends on how they reallocate their resources, and what their factual situation for each of the firms is. So I won't be able to comment something on this right now.
Okay. Okay. Another thing you mentioned, Vivek, is that internships are really important. That is the time when you can evaluate how much you are interested in the sector. At the same time, it gives the option for the firms to evaluate you and see if you are fit for the firm, right? Now,
Yeah.
can you can you suggest us or can you give us your feedback as to what are the major requirements or what are the major aspect ingredients a law firm sees or you as a partner, a hiring partner sees in an intern during his internship. So what are the major do's and don'ts for an intern when he's interning with a top tier firm like yours?
Okay. So with an intern, you would presume that the LCM there is the person is smart. The second thing is interested in corporate practice. Usually, if it is not sought out, the allocation during internships are pretty random, right? In most firms, so you're not able to determine whether the person is interested in project finance. It's also way for the person to discover. But what you're looking at that point in time is research skills, ability to convey what they've what their finding is, writing skills, and you will also see their initiative and their ability to learn. So, and how much they generally know, what is their overall knowledge, right? If I'm asking about Contracts Act, or if I'm asking about Sale of Goods Act, they need to know the fundamentals. So those are the key things that I will look at. I am not looking for an intern to be what do you call, knowing everything. Or if I ask them, which is that RBI master circular or notification, and they should say November 6th, 2016. So we are not looking for that at an internship stage. But if somebody comes and tells me that this is the question, if they're able to figure out, okay, yes, I know where to look, this which is the right avenue. Their research methodology should be good. Their ability to get answers, understand what's happening and what the queries are, and present it. These are the key things that I will look at. And if they know about the sector and the practice, right? Nothing like it. So if usually what happens is, and this is typically the case right now, and it's nothing to say that it's not right, but the question is, how do you set interns apart? So if somebody comes to me, I talk about a facility agreement, they've seen it, they understand it, right, broadly. Or if I say security trustee, or when I say indenture of mortgage, if they know what an indenture of mortgage is, it will set them apart, as opposed to what you usually require to do is, if there's a new intern, never have practiced with project finance team or looked at a document, you will sit them down and explain it to them, because you're not expecting them to know, right? Knowing will set you apart. So most people are reasonable. Most firms, I think, will be reasonable, not expecting you to know, but slowly and steadily, because of the avenues available to them, it will show them in a different light if it appears that they've taken the initiative to know or learn what they're going to do in the next month. So that is something which will set people apart.
Right. Right. So, coming to the next step, Vivek, once my internship is over, possibly I've got a PPO, I come to the interview level, right? Now, as a project finance lawyer, right, uh, what would be your line of questions be based on? Will it be based on the candidate's CV? Will it be based on current affairs in the sector? Or will it be based on something specific to the project finance sector? What would be your line of questions when you are taking the interview?
So if I am taking the
Especially when,
interview,
sorry.
yeah, I am taking the interview, it will depend. If I am aware that the person wants to do project finance and that is what they're applying for, then some of my questions will be directed towards their understanding of project finance. And if it is not, if it is general, like our firms will take rotations. They're allowed to, they're given the opportunity to work with different firms, sorry, different teams before being allotted the final one. In which case, the questions will be general law, current affairs, just to understand how the person is, to find whether they are personable, what drives them, and their ability to learn, and what's gotten them here, why are they doing this, why a firm, and things like that. Like because I think the fundamental is, if the what usually most firms will look for a new joinee is, they want to do that, they are driven, and they're willing to put in the effort, right? And the fundamentals are good, and they're generally smart, because everything else can be taught, and most of it is taught by practice. And you will see the trajectory of different people being different if you know about your practice earlier. So if you have the opportunity, that I would have done that if it was available to me then, assuming that I know what I want to do before a project finance. So the question is, since that information is available now, if you want to do a capital markets internship, or if you want to do a project finance internship or an M&A internship, you can ask for that to the HR through your ICC, or when you're applying, they will appreciate that. Usually you would know that your internship is going to be in a month or 2 months time. Usually you'll have adequate information, that when your internship is going to start, and if you've asked for the particular team, usually they will also be able to allocate you upfront, because there is no allocation typically which happens. It is more or less random unless it's asked for, right? So they have the ability to assign you specific teams if you want. Now that gives you a head start. You have 2 months time to prep up for that. Now that completely depends on how you want to use your internship. If you want to use your internship as the clincher, and if your objective is that I want to put a good impression, I want to ensure that they call me back, that I want to get a job at whichever place that you're interning,
Yeah.
so that initiative and the preparation will definitely show. So if that opportunity is there, is by all means, I think, uh, everything permitting, should be exercised.
Great. Vivek, taking even a step forward, I have joined the team, right? As a fresher, I've joined the team as an associate. Now, as an associate, as a young lawyer practicing in project finance sector, can you give me some do's and don'ts as a young lawyer practicing in your sector?
Do's and don'ts, I think they are more or less similar, right, to what we've discussed. Do's and don'ts. Uh, Do's is figure out whether it interests you or not. So that is very important. I think everybody knows that the practice is demanding, not just this, any corporate practice. So try and fit in where what interests you most. So your ability to do better work and to continue for a longer period of time will be better if you try and fit yourself into the practice that is interesting to you. So that is one thing that I would request everybody to do as soon as they join any place. Try and find what is that you want to do, right? And the second thing is, read, and be open to learning, because the first day of joining the firm, you are the star, the fifth year of college, right? The next day you're at the bottom of the chain immediately. So there is a stark thing thrown at your face that so you have to start from scratch. So just keep an open mind, and it's a very organic process learning. Uh, so it's just more or less about putting in the hard work and keeping an open mind about picking up things and figuring out whether this is what you want to do.
Sure. So we are receiving a lot of subject-based question. I'll wrap up the career part soon. Now, just possibly a couple of more questions with respect to career. One forum for me as a project finance lawyer are joining a law firm, right? Who may have a specialized sector or may not, but still into this sector, right? What are the other forums where I can work while practicing project finance law? I mean, government or corporates, what kind of corporates, in that way? What are the different forums available to me to join?
So let me just put it that not necessarily limited to project finance. Because if that is the case, then there is a very limited area where you can work in. You can work with firms, you can work with banks, you can work in-house as a company, but there your job will not only be limited to project finance. You will do other stuff as well. Part of it will also include project finance, but you can of course join banks who are active in this space as an in-house counsel. So, but let me answer your question in terms of projects in infrastructure, because that is a larger universe which also gives you a greater opportunity to do different things. Infrastructure involves a lot of disputes. Arbitration is the way to go. So that is one of the very lucrative and promising avenues where you can focus your practice. If you want to take up, say, construction or infrastructure related disputes, there is a specific area just that there are lawyers who focus just on that. So that is one thing you can focus. Policy is another thing where students can take up. There are think tanks around infra companies. There are, I know a few people who've joined the government as OSDs for the planning commission, which discusses and turns out different formats and policies and framework around PPP projects and private party interaction for the infrastructure space. So those are avenues which are there. So when you initially join litigation, unless you're joining somebody's chambers and all, it will be very difficult for you to focus purely on infrastructure, because you get, unless you're joining a senior who has that practice, and by virtue of that you will just get that. But for a lot of people who do not have any backing, or they want to go solo, they may not have that. So it is also organic. It is a function of what you also get, but you have the ability to drive your uh, as you grow, you can focus and steer the kind of cases that you want to develop expertise there.
Okay, okay, okay. One question which again from career we received from Mitali. Now, can will doing CS, right? If I do CS, will that CS company secretary?
Yeah.
Will that help me in this specific sector?
See, company, if you do company secretaryship, then there is no additional benefit that you get only for project finance. You that you get generally working as a corporate lawyer, right? Your understanding of the Companies Act, which is at the base of any corporate practice, right, and including to an extent for what you will do in the project finance as well, because there is a lot of interaction over the companies can do. All the developers are companies at the end of the day, right? So compliances and all is something which is there. And I have seen people who've done their company secretaryship, their understanding of the Companies Act is at a greater detail, so it will only benefit it. But if I say that does it add specifically to a project finance practice, then I don't think so. But it will definitely add to you as a corporate lawyer, regardless of whether you do project finance or any other kind of practice.
Okay. Moving to the chat section, Vivek, one question which we received from Partha was now, due to COVID-19, one of the most affected sectors in terms of breaches, or maybe just in general, is the construction, the infrastructure sector, right? There has been labor issues, there has been contract with contractors, subcontractors, the authority, right? So we have seen a lot of issues from that side. Now, this is a very broad question, but what are the major arrangements which can be made in terms of contractual or from your experience, what you have seen in past few months, which can be done to mitigate these kind of measures, some measures which can be taken to mitigate these kind of issues in future?
Okay, so we have to see that the contract needs to be equitable to start with, right? So there is and the contract is an arrangement to ensure that what is the intention of the parties is achieved. Now, say for example, I put into the contract that regardless of COVID or whatever else, right, you have to complete the construction in three months or 6 months or 3 years, whatever, right? And such a situation arises, are they able to do it regardless of whether it's mentioned in the contract or not? They can't, right? People will leave. Government will say you shut down shop, you can't do anything. They can't operate against what the law is. So regardless of what the contract says or not, it's difficult to ensure that the work may get done. You may achieve a contract where you have the right that to call a breach, as opposed to a regular contract, construction contract, where there will be provisions around force majeure. Force majeure clause will typically say that in case where you are not able to perform your obligations because of certain events which are not foreseeable, which are beyond your control, and you couldn't have done anything about it, you tried to mitigate it, nothing could happen, in which case there is no breach of your obligations, and to the extent of the number of days such events exist, the performance gets suspended and pushed by those many days. Typically a force majeure clause would say that. So that ensure having such equitable clauses in an agreement ensures that the objective of the contract is achieved. Just having an obligation in the contract doesn't achieve the purpose, so you have to ensure. So if you are the employer for the contractor, you may say, regardless of everything you do it, I may call a breach, but my objective of entering into the contract was to ensure that the building is constructed. That is not getting done, right?
Right.
And the contractor also, for that matter, if I am advising the contractor and there is a clause in the contract which says regardless of anything I need to do it, with failing which I will be in breach and I may have to give damages, I will not advise the contractor to sign that contract, right? Or for that matter, as I was saying, when you're doing the diligence, like I was giving an example of construction contract, sorry, concession agreements, you will risk that okay, this contract doesn't have a term on force majeure, so if COVID happens, he will I, even with full intention and ability, can't do anything in that case, and he has the ability to call a breach and claim damages. So what I will do is, either I will say, depending on my risk appetite, I'll say, boss, I can't do it. I can't sign this contract. So you go find some other contractor. So sophisticated contractors will not be found who will sign a contract without that. So he's only going to get somebody who may not have that much experience to even know that this is a risk, who will enroll into that. So there is one way or the other, he's at a detriment. The second thing is, if I choose to sign that contract, instead of 100, I will charge him 150. That okay, tomorrow if you claim that breach, that 50 additional which I'm charging, I will give you back as damages. So in effect, there is no specific, there are contractual measures, but it doesn't help anybody. If the event becomes impossible, right, you can't do anything about it. In any case, even contractually, if you put anything, the law provides you protection under section 56, that if the performance has become impossible, then the contract can be frustrated, and to that extent it becomes void.
Right.
So the law also gives you protection, knowing that these events, the contract has to be an equitable contract.
Right. Just a follow up on this, Vivek. Even assuming we are not into this situation, but historically, and we have seen it in most of the project, that cost overrun and the time overrun, right, is a general issue in this sector. We have seen government spending 2x money on a project where a budget X was allocated, but it was overrun 2x plus Y, right? Now, according to you, in your experience, what are the major reasons behind it, and any way to mitigate those issues?
Yeah, so see, these are very common: cost overrun and time overrun, right?
Right.
So typically what you would do in this case, the key reasons for this is, one is delay in grant of approvals from the government, right? There's a lot of red tapeism. Second is delay in land acquisition for the project. So I'll start by, okay, just taking a step back, I'll tell you where does the project start. Once you have the right, you have to start developing it. And during the construction stage, there's a concept called SCOD, which is called a scheduled commencement commercial operations date. So which is the time which is given to the developer, that from this date until that date you put up the project. If it is a road, you ensure that after the SCOD, cars can go on that. If it is a power plant, you say from the SCOD you can generate the electricity. So complete everything. Now for developing the project, there are multiple things which are required. One is land acquisition, government approvals, procurement, and things like that. So time overrun can happen because of delay in approvals, delay in acquisition of land, delay in supplies, just inefficiencies by the contractor itself, right? A force majeure for that matter. If there's an earthquake situation like this, right? 6 months, no work is being done. So it pushes the completion time. So these are the events which contribute towards time overrun. Time overrun may also automatically result to a cost overrun as well. While it is not necessary, cost overrun can be independent as well, but good likelihood that time overrun will also result in a cost overrun. A cost overrun by itself happens because of what? Cost overrun will happen because of currency fluctuations. If you have contracts that you signed, say for that matter, in dollars, without having done adequate hedging, so at the time when you have to make the payment, if the rupee has become 80 instead of 50 when you had signed it, so that increases the cost. Because of any delay, regular inflation will also increase the cost overall. How to mitigate this is, as I said, somebody has to pay for it, for the project to complete, right? And this obligation is put on the sponsor or the shareholder to fund any cost overrun related expenses, so that the lenders are ensured that the project completes. And second is that the lenders do not have to increase their exposure. So this is typically how it is mitigated. In terms of time overrun, you will have obligations covenants in the loan agreement, setting out that the developer needs to inform the lender on a regular basis what is the progress of the project. So every 2 months or every 3 months there is a construction report which is provided to the lenders for them to be able to keep a track on the development of the project, so that they can take any corrective actions at the first instance where they can see that the timeline may not be met. So it's not only a hard and cut obligation that okay, I will take any action only when you don't meet that date finally, but if there are early symptoms, I can take corrective measures and impose them on the developer as well. So the lenders also keep a check on this.
Right, right. Vivek, I know you have a very busy schedule, and I wouldn't want to take much of your time, but possibly if I can quickly take a couple of more questions from the chat section. Suchita has asked the question, with respect to project financing to SRA, is it the same, or is there a different approach to it when we talk about SRA projects?
So SRA, when you're talking of slum rehabilitation projects, is
Correct, correct.
yeah? So
I think
typically,
that should be the right.
yeah. So typically, SR funding for real estate, especially housing, is not covered within the general concept of a project finance. So project finance is more of real infrastructure assets. Well, if you see, I had mentioned real estate, but typically those will be commercial real estate projects, right? Where you do the lease discounting, which basically means that whatever leases that the developer will get after developing the commercial real estate project will be used for repayment. The core thing that needs to be seen is that it is for a specific project, and the revenues from that project will be used to repay the lenders. In case of an SRA, right, how you develop and then you will sell it. So SRA project, there is a slum. You develop that. Part of the SRA development is that you have rights to develop a new building, and you will develop a another building where you have to rehabilitate the people who are staying in the slums, right? And you have the ability to monetize the sale of that asset. Typically, you will see that such real estate developers do not do a SPV wise development of these projects. So long story short, in the larger scheme, real commercial housing projects are typically not seen or funded as project finance.
Okay. Slightly technical question, Vivek. We have a question. What is your opinion on the TOT model, toll operate transfer model, as it possesses comparatively less risk compared to other models such as PPP? Any comments on that? Do you
Yeah.
think TOT model is a better as compared to other models?
No, so TOT is can't be compared to any other model. TOT model is very different. A TOT model, the risk is much lower for the developers, and that is the reason why the authorities do end up getting more money. The reason why the risk is low, TOT projects, which is toll, operate, and transfer, as opposed to the other models for road projects, which is BOT, build, operate and transfer, DBFOT, design, build, operate and transfer. Then you have the HAM model, you have the annuity model, where
Right.
part of the obligations of the developer is to also construct the road. In
Right.
case, so there is construction risk there. So the developer is putting in money, putting in investment to develop the road, and uh, then they have the rights, depending on the model that they have. Then they have a right, I'll give an example of BOT. Then they have a right to collect the tolls to recoup their investment, right? So there is an investment which is gone, and this can be seen typical to any other project financing where there is a construction phase, and where there's a construction phase, there is an inherent risk in the project coming up properly, on time, without cost overrun, time overrun, etc. So those risks are associated there, as opposed to a TOT model where there is an already constructed asset in place. So TOT rights or concessions are only granted where the road is already there. The obligations of the concessionaire in this case are limited to operations and maintenance. You know, you will spend money for operations and maintenance. You will take up that obligation. Either you will do it by yourself or you will engage an O&M contractor, and then you have the right to collect and appropriate the tolls. As because you are not putting in any investment, right? So why should you be granted the right to toll? Because the investment is very minimal, O&M costs. This is the reason why in the TOT model there is a concession fee, very high concession fee, which is paid to the government. So the government has in effect securitized the receivables that it would have collected if they would have operated the road for say 10 years. So instead of 10 years, I assuming with the escalation in toll, I would have gotten 10,000 crores in 5 years, collected 10,000 crores, but with the time value of money, they say, okay, why don't you give me 7,000 crores as the sub-concession fee, then you operate and maintain it, then you collect the toll. If it is lower than 7,000, it's your risk. If it is more than 7,000, your gain. So the government also wins. So definitely it is what do you call, a model which has low risk, but we cannot compare it to other models because the scope of work is very different. It doesn't involve construction, so inherently it will have uh, comparatively lower risk. But
Great.
for
Thanks.
assets which are
Yeah.
operational, it's a very good model. It's very successful in, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Vivek. There are a few questions in the chat section. I would request those viewers if you can also share those on the email. We'll respond to you separately. Just to close, Vivek, any other suggestion, any other feedback for all the viewers here? And I'm guessing that since they have joined this webinar specifically on project finance, they are in a way interested in this sector, right? So I'm sure they are looking forward to make career in this sector, looking forward to work in this sector. Any other suggestion, any other feedback for the viewers here?
So suggestions, I think it will border on repetition, but I'll quickly make 2 or 3 points. So bear with me if I've already said that. Is just focus on your fundamentals, read up about project finance, and you can wherever you can. And I think SkillX is also running a course on that, so you might want to explore that. Uh, there are certain books that you can which gives you a great understanding of project finance. I can recommend, there's a book by Piyush Joshi on laws on infrastructure sector. Then there is a book by Graham Winter, Project Finance. Graham Winter is an Alan Overy partner, I think now is retired, but it's a great book. Then there is a Philip Wood on Project Finance securitization, and there's a Roy Good on issues around collateral and security. So these are certain books. I think I can pass it on to Utkarsh, who can probably share it with the group. Uh, uh, Especially to start with, you can read up about this book, which is easily available, Piyush Joshi, Laws Around Infrastructure Sector, because that will give you a good understanding of what laws govern each of these sectors. There are myriad of laws. It works on delegated legislation, the entire infrastructure space, and that is the reason why I said there are different uh, fundamentals of laws are very important. You will read the constitution, you will read administrative laws. Almost each of the sectors have their own regulators. From a financing perspective, there is RBI, there is SEBI to an extent, now that there are InvITs and everything, oil and gas has PNGRB, roads has NHAI, telecom has TRAI and DOT who set out rules and regulations. So it will give you a good snapshot of that. I think is a good start for you to look at that book and read up as much as possible. If you're interested in project finance, actively seek out internships with project finance teams. When you join the team, express your interest that you've sought this team, because the team will not know, because HR is not going to tell that ABC had sought out this team specifically, you know and just, I think, make use of your internship. That is one of the biggest, can't stress enough on that. So to figure out whether you want to do it and how to do it. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Vivek. I think all your inputs, all your suggestions as the industry leader, as the industry expert, it makes sense for all of us. It makes sense for students. It will help them to understand the sector itself. To it will help them to shape their career. So thanks a lot for all the time you have spared today, Vivek, and for each and every word, each and every input you have given to us, to our students. Right. Thank you all the viewers for joining today. Just one request. So the objective of these sessions, these webinars are again to bring you industry experts like Vivek and help you understand a specific practice area, mostly the more specialized practice area, and to help you shape your career in the same, right? Which was the whole point today, right? We will be conducting similar sessions in future. I'll be sharing a link to a feedback form on the chat section. You'll also receive it on email. I would request you if you can fill that, and also give us any recommendation on any further topics or practice area you want. We'll be happy to conduct more sessions, more learning exercises for you. So thank you everyone. Thank you everyone for joining. Thanks a lot, Vivek, for joining. Thanks a lot for sparing time. And have a good day. Have a great weekend.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Thanks, Utkarsh and the SkillX team. Thanks.
Thank you, Vivek.